Welcome to an online event of the Affiliation of Christian Biologists and the Affiliation of Ministers, Theologians, and Philosophers, two divisions within the American Scientific Affiliation. My name is Brian Groyle, and I'm president of the biology group. Tonight's event is the third in a series of 4 collaborative events that we are hosting on the broad topic of the human soul, human identity, and human consciousness. Past events in this series have featured theologian Joel B. Green of Fuller Theological Seminary, who gave a monist perspective on the human soul, and Christian philosopher Dean W. Zimmerman of Rutgers University, who gave a dualist perspective. This evening, we are delighted to have ASA member Bill Newsome as our guest speaker. Bill is the Harmon Family Professor of Neurobiology and the founding director of the Wu Chai Neurosciences Institute at Stanford University. He received a BS degree in physics from Stetson University and a PhD in biology from the California Institute of Technology. Dr. Newsome is a leading investigator in systems and cognitive neuroscience. He has made fundamental contributions to our understanding of neural mechanisms underlying visual perception and simple forms of decision-making. Among his many honors are the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award of the American Psychological Association, the Dan David Prize of Tel Aviv University, the Carl Spencer Lashley Award of the American Philosophical Society, and the Champalimaud Vision Award. Dr. Newsome has also given several distinguished lectureships, both in this country and abroad, and was elected to membership in the National Academy of Sciences in 2000 and to the American Philosophical Society in 2011. Finally, he co-chaired the NIH Brain Working Group, which was charged with forming a national plan for the National Brain Initiative. The title of Bill's presentation tonight is Neuroscience, Freedom, and the Necessity of Consciousness for Moral Growth. Bill, it's great to have you join us.
It's great to be here, and I thank you for the invitation, Brian. I know that I'm the third of 3 speakers on this general topic of consciousness and the brain and behavior. And I'm going to take us in a bit of a different direction tonight from Joel Green and Dean Zimmerman, focused really specifically on monist versus dualist pictures of the human soul. And I will have just a few things to say about soul, and I will come at it in a bit of a roundabout way through a presentation that I am going to give you that centers primarily on the question of freedom and free will and how we can understand that in the face of biological mechanisms for behavior. And I'll let you take this in whatever direction you want to during the question and answer period. And if we want to go off into consciousness, I've got 2 or 3 more slides to lay out a few thoughts. But if you really want to focus on freedom and decision making, then I'll be happy to stick to that turf. As Brian said, I'm going to talk on this topic here: neuroscience, freedom, and the importance of consciousness for moral growth. And my students always tell me that I should start out any talk, any lecture, talk, whatever, with a big picture. So the big picture here is this. You're here on the somewhat insignificant planet on the outskirts of the galaxy that's one among billions of hundreds of billions of galaxies in the universe. But the amazing thing about this to a neurobiologist is that everything we know about that universe and every action that we take to impact that universe is mediated by this 3 pounds of tissue between our ears up here that we call the brain, or the central nervous system. And those of us who study this as, are workaday scientists trying to understand how the brain works, we're committed to the idea that there are mechanisms that, we know that there's about 100 billion nerve cells up there. We know that there are about 100 trillion synaptic connections between these nerve cells, and it's extraordinarily complicated. But we also believe that, like the heart or like the kidney or like the lung, It's a biological tissue with mechanisms to be discovered and to understand how the thing works. And we do that in part just out of curiosity. The fact that it's maybe one of the two most amazing miracles in the universe in my mind is that out of the firing of 100 billion neurons, the electrical firing, something like our consciousness arises. So it's just intrinsically fascinating. But also, if we ever want to be able to treat neurological diseases, which are among the most vexing and most difficult that modern medicine tries to deal with, we've got to understand the mechanisms and understand how this thing is functioning. So here's what I call the central dogma of neuroscience. That's obviously for you biologists, it's a takeoff on Francis Crick's central dogma of molecular biology. The central dogma of neuroscience, I would say that all of our behavior and all of our mental life, including the sense of a conscious and continuing self, is inextricably linked to the biology of the brain. I would also include in here, including our religious sense, are inextricably linked to the biology of the brain. Now, I chose my words a bit carefully here. I'm not saying that it's determined by, I'm not using highly reductionistic language here, but the fact that these mental lives that we enjoy are inextricably linked to the biology of the brain receives increasing confirmation as the years and decades go by. And that point was made, I think, ably by both Joel Green and by Dean Zimmerman in their previous talks in this series. But just for those of you who are not scientists, and I know that we have several of you who are not, the evidence that makes neurobiologists like myself increasingly convinced of this sort of thing are new technical abilities to manipulate neural activity at different points in the brain of experimental animals and be able to see the wide range of behaviors that can be dramatically influenced. I'm going to show you one of these here. I'm going to show you, I did want to say before I show this to you, just to touch base with Joel and Dean in previous lectures, that this central dogma here, which I subscribe to actually, is substance monism for sure. But property monism in terms of consciousness and how consciousness arises from the brain, property monism or property dualism, which Dean Zimmerman touched on, well, was a central part of Dean Zimmerman's talk. I'd like for us to converse about that. But I am talking about substance monism, which would be a lack of dualism. I don't believe there's a spirit world and a physical material world and inside our heads, and that somehow the mental world has to find a way to interact with the physical world. That's an intractable problem, and I'm not sure it's even a coherent position, but we'll talk about this. Okay, so here's I wanted to tell you about this technical tour de force with a technique called optogenetics that was invented about 15 years ago now here at Stanford. Well, actually almost 20 years ago now here at Stanford. And what optogenetics is, it's a trick for getting genes from algae that live in the ocean. And these genes code for proteins that are channels that sit in membranes of cells. If you can insert this gene through genetic engineering techniques into the DNA of the cells in a mouse's brain, for example, these are channel proteins that allow electrical current to come into the cells of which they're a part. And they're also photosensitive. So when light photons of a certain wavelength are absorbed, that channel opens and currents flow into the nerve cells, causing them to fire or become active. But if you show light of a different wavelength, a different kind of channel in the membrane that you've also inserted through genetic engineering inhibits the cells. So this is a technique for turning on and turning off specific circuits of neurons. Any circuit or any group of cells that can be defined genetically, usually you can find a way to get an optogenetic handle on it. So you can actually turn these circuits on and off while an animal's behaving. And this is extraordinarily powerful. And there are a lot of people trying to find ways to apply it clinically to human neurological disease. But that's not really there yet. But, there's some promise. What I'm going to show you is the effects of manipulating a small group of cells. And when I say small, I mean a few thousand group of cells in the amygdala, which is a a deep brain structure that we know is involved in the regulation of emotion and displays of behavior indicating emotion. And this is you're going to see optogenetics in action here. This is a video that was made in the Anderson lab at Caltech. And what you're going to see is two mice in a home cage, as we call it. And one of the mice has that cable attached to its head, like I showed you, and that's a fiber optic cable that sends light down through that fiber optic, which is implanted in the amygdala. And you'll see that this mouse can run around and he doesn't really pay any attention to this cable at all. What he does pay attention to is it's a male mouse in its home cage, and there's a female intruder that has been introduced into the cage. And when a female intruder is introduced, the male is very interested in her, surprise, surprise, and tries to make friends with her, surprise, surprise. But then they're going to turn this laser on and start shining light into the amygdala, to this group of neurons in the central amygdala that have been labeled appropriately, genetically engineered with these genes, in which we know that light, when you see the words come on that say laser on, it means that the laser is turned on, light is pumping into the amygdala and activating this group of neurons. And you're going to see this male's posture toward this female changes abruptly when that happens. Okay, so this is optogenetic stimulation of medial amygdala. So there's the male, the dark one, that's very interested in this female intruder. And now the laser gets turned on, and you can see suddenly he goes into attack mode, right? I mean, this is extremely aggressive behavior. This is the way that male would react to another male intruder on his home territory. But then the laser's going to go off, and he just becomes a normal, friendly male trying to make friends with the female again. And this is very repeatable. You know, you can turn on and off and on and off, and that male reliably goes into that kind of aggressive behavior. And that behavior is very organized, clearly. You know, it's not just twitching muscles in some random kind of way. That's a very organized behavior. And in any mammal, that kind of behavior is accompanied by elevated cortisol levels, and we believe, we infer, by serious emotional arousal. And probably that female is having emotional arousal as well, right? So it's this kind of evidence. I'm just giving you one little piece, right? Just one little piece. But this kind of thing is growing with more and more rapidity over my decades as a career, over my career for several decades in neuroscience. And it's what convinces people like me about that the central dogma is it's getting us a long way into the nervous system and a long way toward dissecting the mechanisms underlying different behaviors and emotional states. And, will it get us all the way there? Maybe, maybe not, but certainly the returns are good enough that we keep going. So in the face of this kind of mechanistic sort of understanding and interpretation of behavior, the question always arises, what about free will, right? What about freedom? And that's this is a view, somewhat whimsical, a whimsical view from Emo Phillips, who's an actor and comedian. His comment is, "I am not a fatalist, but even if I were, what could I do about it?" Okay, and that's his take on free will. Now, here's St. Paul, apostle of the early Christian church. All of you are very familiar with from Romans, the 7th chapter of Romans, and Paul says, "I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do." Okay, and here's a man who's clearly struggling with this notion of freedom versus, what Paul called the law of sin and death, right? And he's perplexed at some level inside of his brain about his own behavior and how little control he seems to have over it. Now, in all of you who are biblical scholars know that the other strain that runs through the Bible is a real emphasis on personal responsibility for actions, right? And that we have the ability to choose, and it's incumbent upon us as Christians to make good choices as much as possible. So this is a classic sort of illustration of this from the book of James. Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. right? Faith without works is dead. So this really emphasizes the personal responsibility and how these two themes, our inability to control our own behavior, yet our responsibility for our actions. This is exactly the problem that people have been struggling with for many centuries. And St. Augustine of Hippo also struggled with this in his classic works. So there's several modern views about this that I don't like or subscribe to very much. And one is complete bottom-up determinism, the complete reductionist view that all action, all forces, all causes reside at the atomic level, the four fundamental forces in nature, right? Um, Gravity, electricity and magnetism, strong nuclear forces and weak nuclear forces. That those are the only forces that do work, and ultimately everything is reduced to that level. I don't like this for various reasons. I don't think it's good science actually, and I don't think it's good philosophy. We can go into that if you want to. Some people see a way to make room for free will, and with quantum mechanics, the fact that at the quantum mechanical level, things are probabilistic and indeterministic, and at the quantum world, at the quantum level, there is no such thing as a deterministic world. I actually don't think that's a good answer because once you get up to large molecules like DNA and like channel proteins, much less cells, you're at levels where quantum mechanical effects are minuscule. Okay, you're really in a Newtonian billiard ball kind of world, and in quantum mechanics doesn't really solve this problem for us, I don't think. Here's another thing that I don't think works, and this is the notion, and I think this is the back pocket notion that all of us, almost all of us, walk around with in the world, and the typical man and woman on the street run around with, that to be free, a behavior or an act or a choice to be free means that it's not caused by anything. Okay. And the notion here, the intuition is that if there's a cause, if there's something that's sort of governing your behavior and making you do this, then you're not free. Okay. Now, if that's the definition of freedom, I don't subscribe to it. I don't think we have that kind of freedom. I think there are causes, there are mechanisms in the brain. Much of our behavior is not only unfree, it's unconscious. We're not even conscious of the sources, the causes that go into our behavior. So I don't like that. That you could call that a radical libertarian point of view, and I don't subscribe to that as a biologist either. What I think when we talk about freedom, what we are most trying to get at is self-determination or autonomy. Quantum mechanics may give you some kind of random effects, but randomness is no more meaningful than complete determination as far as I'm concerned. What we really mean about freedom is self-determination. So if somebody sticks a gun at your head and says, do this thing or else, that is not self-determined. You're being coerced. All of us are citizens of a particular country. We all pay taxes. I'm sure we all have areas in which we think that our tax monies are put to immoral purposes. And that's not self-determination, right? If you're going to be a part of the system, then that's that you're embedded in it. But where we are most free, I think, is where we feel like we're in charge and to some extent of our own behavior. And here's a simple way that I would define this, and I would say that for me, what self-determination means is that my behavior is caused, at least in part, that's an important qualifier right there, at least in part, by my beliefs, my values, my reason, my goals, my aspirations. Okay. Those sorts of higher order, I would call those higher order levels of organization in the nervous system, that beliefs are in the nervous system, values are in the nervous system, reason is in the nervous system, goals and aspirations are in there, but they're higher level configurations of neural activity. And for my money, this is what I really think of as soul. When I talk about soul, I use it almost synonymously with the self. What is my innermost self, my true core self, my true core values, my true core beliefs and aspirations. And I would equate these kinds of high level of organization with soul, but we can talk about that later. Now, a corollary here is that conscious, rational thought plays a causal role in my behavior. And I'm going to make an argument later about why I think that consciousness is causal, and we should consider it to be causal. In some of the previous talks, you've entertained this notion that the consciousness is epiphenomenal, right? That it's like the froth on top of a wave. It's there, but it has no impact on what the wave does. That energy is all in the water, not in the froth on top of the wave. But I think that consciousness is central to behavior and to moral growth, as I'll say toward the end of the talk. And I think the key issue here is what counts as a cause. Okay, is it only the four fundamental forces in physics, or can we ascribe causality to higher levels of the nervous system? And I think that we can, and I'm going to develop that argument for you. And I don't think it's a terribly profound or terribly novel argument. I think actually those of you who are biologists, you'll recognize this as just kind of workaday biology. And it starts with this notion here that neuroscience explanation, and I would say that virtually all biological explanation, any of the special sciences, is intrinsically multi-level. And I suspect this goes on down to chemistry as well, so some of you may be more expert than me. But neuroscience explanation is intrinsically multi-level. And that I'm going to argue that causality, and I'll try to define that in a very practical way, that causality is present at every level of any biological mechanism. All right, so I'm going to start making that argument right now. So here's an example of something that neurobiologists like to study. A cognitive or systems neuroscientist like myself we're interested in cognitive phenomena like attention, like memory, like decision making, like motor planning, like in humans, long-term planning and language. But this is one that's a favorite, has been a favorite for decades of neuroscientists, long-term spatial memory. So spatial memory is the cognitive capacity you have to find your car in a parking lot like this. Now, some of us are good at that. Some of us are terrible at it. I'd say I'm a C minus kind of student finding my car in a situation like this. But the cognitive effects and the mechanisms in the brain that allow you to do this are of real serious interest to cognitive neuroscientists. So the first thing that a scientist will do who wants to try to start understanding how the brain accomplishes this feat is you define this, an operational definition that you can actually manage in a laboratory, usually with an animal. So spatial memory is the thing that we want to explain and understand, and which the philosophers would call an explanandum. And the typical way to operationalize this in a laboratory, it's not the only way to operationalize it, but the most common one is to train mice to navigate some kind of maze. Does everyone see the mouse? Dana, is the mouse and okay? I just want to be sure that I'm in sync with my thing here. So we train a mouse to navigate a maze, and this is something we can do in a laboratory, something we can quantify. How long does it take the animal to run the maze? As the animal learns, that time gets shorter and shorter. So what does the learning curve look like? And we can characterize this behavior very nicely. Now, a major discovery of the 1950s or so was that this ability to do spatial navigation in a maze like that depends dramatically on this structure in the middle of the brain called the hippocampus. And it's the one with these purple lines here. This is the hippocampus. This is the cerebral cortex up here, and your brainstem with your thalamus and hypothalamus are all down lower. But this is the hippocampus, a favorite subject of study by neuroscientists. These are the different fields of the hippocampus. And if you destroy that structure in the middle of the brain in a mouse, or we know in a human, spatial memory and many other kinds of memory, episodic memory, are badly damaged. In humans, this was done as a treatment for intractable epilepsy. And that's not really done anymore. This was in the 1950s and 1960s, even into the 70s and 80s. Some pretty radical treatments for epilepsy are done. I mean, brain ablations are done to cure intractable epilepsy. People who are having 30, 40 seizures a day and are just totally incapacitated. But there are certain structures that are no-go zones for the neurosurgeons. You do not want to take out some piece of brain that's forming epileptic seizures and have the person wake up and not be able to talk, have their seizures controlled but not be able to talk, or not be able to do any kind of memory, okay? But so We know that the hippocampus is really important for this. But to neuroscientists, that just creates another mystery. What is it about this hippocampus and those cells, and there are millions of cells firing, that endow this property of spatial memory? So people start looking and they look at these connections between nerve cells, the synapses, and there are treatments where you can get synapses to increase their strength between two neurons or to decrease their strength. The increasing one is called long-term potentiation. The decreasing one is called long-term depression. So the synaptic connections change during the formation of memories. And if you remember anything tomorrow about the contents of this lecture tonight, it will be because we have physically changed your synapses in your brain. We've revved up some of them and we've reduced others. And across a large population, those increases and decreases, their pattern comprise the transition from short-term memory to long-term memory. But then neuroscientists, there's kind of neuroscientists that isn't satisfied with this. I said, well, what is it exactly in mechanistic molecular terms that cause synaptic depression or synaptic excitation? And there's this marvelous molecule sitting in the membranes of these synapses called the NMDA receptor. And this NMDA receptor is really crucial for what we call the plasticity, the ability of synapses to change their strength up or down, okay? And this is a favorite study of neuroscientists. But, there are other people who say, well, where did those receptors come from? How do they get to the synapse? How do when you increase or decrease, does it mean you're putting more copies of this molecule in and out of the synapse? Or are you regulating its activity somehow? And these folks really study the link between genes and the receptor molecules down here. So I've just shown you now to understand spatial memory that we're looking at biological mechanisms, and we've got at least 5 relevant levels here. We've got the behavioral level, so we can get this behavior and quantify it in a water maze. We've got the sort of brain structure level. Then we've got the synaptic plasticity level. Then we've got the individual receptors and the magic of the NMDA receptor. And then we've got the genes down lower that regulate the receptors. Now, we could keep going lower, right? There are chemists who would say, well, what makes a gene work? How does it encode information, such? And we can go several more layers down and keep going till we get to quantum mechanics. We can also go levels higher. This is all within what happens within one individual brain. But above this, there are interacting animals, and a lot of our behavior is shaped and conditioned by our interactions with our members of our fellow species. So you can go to social neuroscience up here, and then you can go higher than that into organizational kinds of complexities that influence it. But I think for spatial memory, to understand spatial memory, this is our sweet spot right here, these 5 levels. I think as you go lower toward quantum mechanics, you're not really learning anything more new about spatial memory. You may be learning some things about the chemistry of genes and such, but spatial memory per se, it's not really very enlightening. And similarly, to go higher is also interesting for social scientists and such. But again, I don't think you're learning very much about spatial memory as you go higher. But in here, I have drawn these arrows in both directions because the classic view is that there are these upward causality, right? That genes cause receptors and receptors make possible long-term potentiation, and that gets organized in ways within the spatial map and hippocampus that presto results in a mouse's ability to navigate a water maze. But I think that there are causal relevance to each of these levels, and that these arrows, properly understood, go up and down. Okay, now, why do I think that? So here I'm taking my cue from sort of a philosopher of neuroscience named Carl Craver, who's at WashU St. Louis. And Carl published this book back in the mid-2000s, I can't remember, 2005, 6, something like that, called Explaining the Brain, and Mechanisms and the Mosaic Unity of Neuroscience. And Carl has a master's degree in experimental neuroscience. He knows neuroscience, But his PhD is in philosophy, but he's kind of done some of both actually over the course of his career. And I actually find this book really cogent. I've read parts of it like 4 or 5 times. And here's the way that here's the core insight with which he talks about mechanistic explanation in neuroscience, but I think this holds for other areas of biology as well. So this is multi-level now, and I've shown you an example of a mechanism that spans at least 5 levels. Multi-level mechanistic explanation in neuroscience. And a key part of his concept that I find very, very attractive as a biologist is this phrase here, mutual manipulability. And he's talking here about parts of a mechanism. And he says a part, and that might be a molecule, it might be a circuit, it might be a brain structure, but a part is a component in a mechanism if one can change the behavior of the mechanism as a whole by intervening to change the component. That is to say, you go in and change something that you believe might be a component of a mechanism for a larger behavior. And if you can change that component and you see a resulting change in the behavior, then you're part of the way in here as a mechanism. But there's this critical conjunction right here. And one can change the behavior of the component by intervening to change the behavior of the mechanism as a whole. Okay, now that's really critical. This is really important. So, and I think it's completely right. So you can manipulate at the level of the receptors and the genes because we can build knockout mice, knock-in mice that have extra copies of the genes and more proteins, or we can build ones that are missing copies of the genes and don't have NMDA receptors. And that changes the ability of the mouse to do many things, including spatial memory. But you can lift that mouse up out of the maze that it knows very well, and you can put it down into a new maze that it has to learn and solve. And all of those circuits in the hippocampus change. And the properties of the cells, single cells in the hippocampus change. So a behavioral manipulation, in my opinion, is just as causal as a molecular manipulation. And Carl refers to this as making a difference. So this is not a fancy-dancy notion about causality, in a book full of equations like Judea Pearl's book on causality. This is a very intuitive kind of thing that anywhere you can go in a mechanism and tweak a knob, turn a knob, you're going to have upward changes on the behavior or higher levels of the mechanism, and you're going to have downward changes on lower levels. So you change the behavior, and you have rippling effects downward to the hippocampus, to the synaptic plasticity, all the way down to the NMDA receptors. And Carl says, he makes the argument that this is how you know you're in a mechanism. This is how you know you're dealing with a mechanism in a biological laboratory. If you think that some receptor is part of a mechanism and you take it out and the behavior doesn't change, then you say, I'm on the wrong path here. Or maybe you say there's redundancy and other molecules can make up the difference, and then that's scientific investigation. That's the way science works. But similarly, if you change the behavior and you don't see changes at the structural and physiological and molecular levels, you suspect, well, I'm on the wrong path here. This is not where the truth lies. And it's really this mutual manipulability here that gives you the conviction scientifically that you're in a mechanism. Now that's important because what it means is that causal relevance resides at all stages of a mechanism. It means I can intervene here at the level of the whole hippocampus and have effects rippling both downward and upward, or I can intervene here behaviorally and have effects rippling downward, or I can intervene down here with gene knockouts or something like that, or I can intervene here with pharmacological agents that block the NMDA receptor, and I'm going to have rippling downward effects and rippling upward effects. So this is really, I think, a key notion. And let's go back now. I've taken you into this deepish dive into spatial navigation because I want to make that critical point. But what's at stake here for the larger argument? Remember that I argued that the core elements of freedom are self-determination and autonomy, and therefore responsibility for our actions. And I argued that the key issue here is what counts as a cause. And what I think is that this notion of mutual manipulability and upward and downward cascading effects from biological manipulations shows and strengthens an argument that causal relevance is distributed throughout multiple layers of any biological mechanism. And the key thing here is intervention. Can I intervene at a particular level and cause both upward and downward effects? And if I can do that, then that's causality to me. Okay. And that's causal relevance to me. So all of this is in service of finding a way, if we can find a way to talk meaningfully about non-fundamental causation, and by non-fundamental, I mean causation or causal relevance that's not simply the four forces in physics. Now, that's not to say that anything at a higher level violates the laws of physics. I don't think they do, not in a routine way every day in the way that brains work. But so if we can find a way to talk about non-fundamental causation, and I think we have to, then we can take mental causation and responsibility for action seriously. And that's what's at stake. And I think this is a way to start looking at this multi-level explanation and causation that has scientific integrity and opens the door to thinking about higher levels of organization and their effects like values and beliefs and aspirations. So notice what I'm not saying. This is not to say that bottom-up causes are unimportant, because explanatory relevance runs both upward and downward. Okay, so it's we humans and all animals, we're both bottom up and we're top down. I'm going to illustrate this with a couple of quotes. Okay, so this first quote is gene language. It's a quote from Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, in 1976, which is really an excellent book, by the way. And this comes directly out of Dawkins' book. He says, genes swarm in huge colonies, safe inside gigantic lumbering robots. That's us, by the way, that's you and me. Sealed off from the outside world and communicating with it by tortuous indirect routes, manipulating it by remote control. They are in you and me. They created us, body and mind, and their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. Okay? Now, that's a very bottom-up view, that genes are where the action is. So I would say that's a genetic fundamentalist speaking. This is his point of view. Now, Dawkins has a colleague at Oxford, Dennis Noble, who published a book about 30 years after The Selfish Gene. It's called The Music of Life, Biology Beyond the Genome. Also a very famous biologist. This guy was a biophysicist, studied receptors and membranes. And here's a quote from his book, and it's obviously a parody of Dawkins, or at least a commentary on it. And Noble says, genes are trapped in huge colonies, locked inside highly intelligent beings, molded by the outside world, communicating with it by complex processes through which blindly, as if by magic, function emerges. They are in you and me. We are the system that allows their code to be read, and their preservation is totally dependent on the joy that we experience in reproducing ourselves. We are the ultimate rationale for their existence. That's top-down language, right? So we've got bottom-up language, we got top-down language. You got two famous biologists looking at the same data, the same world, and coming to very, very different conclusions. And do we have to choose one or the other? I would say no, we don't have to choose one or the other, because the truth about humans is that we're both. So here's something that really convinced me of this about, 25, 30 years ago now. The Lasker Awards are given out every year by the Albert and Mary Lasker Foundation. Those of you who are biologists will know about them. Those of you who are not will not. But they're basically referred to colloquially within the biomedical community as American Nobel Prizes. They are given every year by the Lasker Foundation to sort of the top discoveries in biomedical science, and awarded to the men and women who made those discoveries. And I was startled back in 2006 to read this in the New York Times The psychiatrist is among 5 chosen for a medical ward. So this avuncular-looking gentleman here with a red bow tie is named Aaron Beck, and I'm betting some of you know who Aaron Beck is or was. I don't actually know whether he's still alive. I think maybe not, but I don't actually know that. Um, so what Aaron Beck, his claim to fame, and the reason he won this award is that he was the inventor of cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay. Now, many of you have probably been in CBT or have someone you love who's in CBT. And cognitive behavioral therapy is a talk therapy that is considered by physicians, psychologists, and insurance actuaries, by the way, to be the most effective treatment for some intractable psychiatric conditions like depression and like anxiety disorder and others. And you have to know a little bit about, to understand why I'm so startled here, you have to know a little bit about the history of psychiatry. Psychiatry before the 1970s was almost totally a talk therapy based profession. We had some drugs at our disposal that could be used, but frequently they were used for a little more than sedative purposes. But in the 1970s, we started discovering all of these neurotransmitter substances inside the brain, like adrenaline, noradrenaline, acetylcholine, serotonin, dopamine. And we started discovering how they worked with their receptors. So a dopamine molecule binds with a receptor molecule, like a lock and a key and a lock, and opens channels in the membrane, or it activates intracellular cascades of signals in the receiving neuron. And the 1970s were a period of extreme discovery about all the chemicals that are floating around doing this neurotransmitter business. And furthermore, other chemicals that could block the receptors so that dopamine, for example, could no longer activate its receptor in the presence of Haldol, which is a dopamine synapse inhibitor. And at last, psychiatrists had tools. They too could write prescriptions. Okay. And the whole field basically went pell-mell toward a prescription writing, drug-based profession, and sort of talk therapies got left in the dust. And that's why in 2006, I was so surprised to see someone who had invented a talk therapy win a Lasker Award. And the reason that he won this is because because of papers like this. I mean, it's now known that our best treatments for really serious acute depression is to use both cognitive behavioral therapy and antidepressant drugs, serotonergic reuptake inhibitor drugs that you're all familiar with. So this paper is one, and this has been reproduced in many studies now, both in adolescents and in adults. And basically, it's comparing antidepressant drugs as a treatment for depression versus cognitive behavioral therapy as a treatment for depression versus both together. Okay. And so you have a group, and so these are randomized, double-blinded studies, so that it gets rid of the propensity for prejudice on part of the scorers. And the bottom line of these studies is that people who are treated with cognitive behavioral therapy and the serotonergic reuptake inhibitors do better than the people who are treated with either alone. The people on average, people will do better treated either alone. We all know from your own experience or your family's experience that not every patient responds the same to either cognitive behavioral therapy or to serotonergic drugs. But on average, the best treatment that we have is to use these two together, okay? Now that tells us something really important about humans, because drug manipulations at the synapse level are a classic bottom-up manipulation. You're reaching into that mechanism, whatever that mechanism is, and however many levels it scales, you're reaching in at the level of receptors and molecules, and you're tweaking there, and you're getting effects at the behavioral level. But cognitive behavioral therapy is a tweak at the behavioral level. What Beck says is that he calls it cognitive restructuring. That's actually the phrase that Beck used. And it's a top-down intervention. So the bottom-up intervention says you modify transmitters and receptors. And the person writing the prescription may not care at all what your relationship with your mother and father was like, what your love life is like, whether you're satisfied with your job. They just care about how much serotonin is in the synapses. But the top-down intervention, they don't really care very much about how much serotonin is in the synapses. They want to change the patient's beliefs and patterns of interaction with the world. Okay, and the lesson here of this of modern psychiatric medicine is that these severe depressive syndromes do better when you acknowledge the reality that humans are both bottom-up and top-down creatures. And Beck called this, CBT, cognitive restructuring. So I take from that beliefs, values, and aspirations matter. They are not the froth on top of a wave. They count, and they count as causal manipulations because you can intervene at that level, you can turn the knob at that level, and you can make your patients better. And so let's go back now several tens of minutes to my argument about autonomy being the key to freedom. And my definition of autonomy is that my behavior is caused at least part by my beliefs, values, memories, goals, and aspirations. Okay, those things that really comprise the core self, or you might or might not, we can talk about it, put the word soul onto this. So, now we all know that much of our behavior is not caused by our beliefs, values, memories, goals, and aspirations. They're caused by unconscious things that we're not even aware of. Social scientists take huge delight, right, in showing this to us, that they'll prime us with some set of readings before asking us a set of questions that are value and ethically loaded. And those readings that one group reads and another group reads, those readings influence how you answer those ethical dilemmas that are posed to you, okay? So social science, and you're not even conscious of this, all right? Social scientists love showing us things like this, and much of our behavior is caused by subterranean things that go way back into childhood, into the culture that we're raised in, into the things that we're exposed to in media, and that we would maybe deny that they even influence us, but with careful experiments, you can show that they do. So, but I think to have a meaningful conception of autonomy, it means that at least in part, and we can discuss the percentage, but at least in part, my behavior comes out of the things that I consider the most core parts of myself: the beliefs, the values, the memories, the goals, and the aspirations. So those that is the core that I believe in for autonomy. And I think that these are higher level, as I said at the outset, these are higher level states of organization of the nervous system. Okay. Your beliefs are in your nervous system. Your values are in there. Your memories are in there. We can manipulate them by manipulating the activity of the nervous system. So this is not a dualist position here. Okay. Because I think that all those things are in the nervous system, but that's what autonomy is, when our behavior is under the control of these things and not external sort of coercive forces or things that we were exposed to and just adopted from our culture in childhood and never examined critically. Okay, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. Okay, so I just want to take this one little detour here before wrapping up. And this is from another talk. Forgive the advertising over here. This is from another talk that I gave, my wife and I gave actually to a group of Stanford alumni. And there are paradoxes about this notion of free will. So one of the first paradox is that freedom, and this is ironic, is substantially about control, right? You tend to think of freedom and control maybe as being kind of opposite to each other. But they're not. Freedom is substantially about control, but it's self-control. Okay, it's your ability to say, no, I'm not going to eat those French fries. I'm going to have the salad instead, right? That you can control yourself that way, or that you feel an antagonistic response coming in an interaction with a family member, but you're able to control that and not express that. or you're willing to forego purchases now for an investment in a college education for your kids or for yourself or for retirement. Okay, that you're more free when you can resist the French fries or you can resist the immediate temptation and actually have control. Now, another paradox here is that some brains have less capacity for control than others, or the same brain at another time, and thus are less free. Okay, so the classic example here is psychosis, right? And our legal system recognizes that somebody in a psychotic break in the early stages of schizophrenia or whatever simply don't have the capacity to control their behavior in the same way that a normal brain that say within one standard deviation of the mean has. And and I would say that they're less free. Okay, so there's natural variation in brains and behavior, just like there is in height or heartbeat or blood pressure or whatever. Um, Now, here's where consciousness comes in. What I'm going to say about consciousness here at the end is that becoming more free is a lifelong process. It's not a state. So it's not as though you're either free or unfree. Okay, there is a spectrum, and we could take a poll of the people here and see where you would put us on the spectrum, totally free or totally unfree. And I guarantee you there will be a distribution. Um, but I think that becoming free is a lifelong process, and we become more free. And I think that consciousness is critical for this. And I'm going to support this with an anecdote. Um, here's the anecdote. So I grew up in North Florida, which you should think of as essentially South Georgia. Uh, North Florida is culturally and politically a part of the South. I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s during Jim Crow, and this signs like this were a common fact of my life. So in my little town of 15,000 people, there was a black school system and a white school system. There were black seats on the bus. There were white seats on the Greyhound bus or the Trailways, whichever you patronize. Ditto for restaurants. You guys know that scene. You know the history, right? And I was raised in that milieu, right? Uh, and how to break out of that, or how I broke out of it, it's a long story, but I would say that the key thing is becoming conscious that this was an unjust pattern, that there were human beings within skins the different color of mine who were being treated in fundamentally different ways solely because of the color of the skin. Okay. And how did that square with, what Paul says, in Christ there is neither male nor female, neither slave nor free. And my little Southern upbringing, I would say neither black nor white. And, I saw that my little town was 30% black. And I saw the first black person in one of my school classes when I was in the 8th grade. By the end of high school, they were all integrated by law during the Kennedy administration. So, we were 70-30, both in the faculty and in the makeup of the classroom. And I can tell you, a lot of people across the South who went through this, and not just the South. I mean, you can see the same thing in Boston and New York. But for a lot of people, this was a traumatic transition, and there was a lot of anger, occasionally violence. And all of us had to work through this in our own ways. For me, a part of the religion, frankly, was a part of my own motivation. But the strategy here is to try to change the beliefs and behaviors. So try to say, all God's children are created equally, and have the same love. Just say that cognitively, okay? Just tell yourself that, and change the behaviors. And that doesn't feel good, but the emotions will follow, okay? But that's effortful. That's effortful stuff. And you don't make that effort until you become conscious in the first place that you're living, fundamentally in an unjust system that's treating certain people unjustly. Now, you can give less flagrant examples of this, right? So I might be grading papers for classes, and I've been doing it for 10 or 15 years, and systematically grading one gender differently from another, or people with one accent in speech from another, or people with one skin color from another. And there may be these biases that I've built up. And I'm going along telling myself I'm doing great. I'm perfectly objective. But when someone shows me evidence that I'm not objective, and I actually see those distributions, and I'm undeniably, I become conscious of my bias, then there's an opportunity to change. Until you're conscious of it, there is no opportunity to change, right? Because there's no issue, because we all tell ourselves these self-justifying stories. But when you're presented with evidence or you become conscious of your own bias, then there's the possibility even of making a moral decision. Until you're not conscious of it, there is no possibility for a moral decision. And this is why that I say that consciousness is causal. And this is why I say that you become more free, that it's a process. And sometimes it's a hard process. Sometimes you have to deliberately mix in situations that are not comfortable to you. So I think that consciousness is important here, and that it's one of those levels of the nervous system. And if we intervene at that level, at that conscious level, the reasoning level, the emotional level, then there's actually some hope of changing behaviors. So I will just close here by saying that I think that understanding the nature of human freedom is the most consequential problem facing the neurobehavioral sciences. Now, I've been using that slide for a couple of decades, and I mostly still believe it. The older I get, the more I think that Alzheimer's disease might actually be more important than the nature of human freedom. Uh, so at least they're rivaling, but this is still extremely important. And it's important for obvious reasons of human dignity and social responsibility. But, I'll just leave you with this last thought here. It's also important for science itself. And this is a quote from John Haldane, who was a famous geneticist in the middle of the 20th century. It's one of my two favorite Haldane quotes. You can ask me the other one later if you want to. Haldane says, "If my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of the atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms." So, there's this circularity here with complete determinism. How can we believe anything about the world if it's complete bottom-up determinism? So I'll say thanks at that point. And, I haven't solved this problem. I mean, people haven't solved it for millennia. Why should I expect to come along and solve it? Much of what I've said here, I've learned from other people. But I tell students when I teach on this in classes, and I co-teach a course every spring on social and ethical issues in the neurosciences, and we tackle some of these topics. But I tell them, you don't have to believe this. There are many problems to be solved. We're still in early days of nervous system investigations, but this is a way to think about these things that are they don't prove anything religiously, but they're open to a religious view of life that values humans and is scientifically has scientific integrity and has human integrity as well. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you for that fascinating and really, really helpful presentation. We'll now begin the Q&A period.
Thank you. When Jesus was asked about the self-control, and I refer to Mark 12, he responded, "Entole," the word for commandment, which is the best way forward for the individual, for the community, and humanity. And he responded, it was the integration or the balance of body, mind, heart, soul. I've been doing studies with Dr. Daniel Siegel, who's with UCLA and principal editor of the neurobiology series and the Norton series. And he has examined the integration of the body, mind, heart, and soul on the neurological basis, and finds that when there is that centeredness, we make the best decisions possible. But what is the fascinating thing is that integration of Jesus's second part of that commandment, which is love. And Dr. Siegel points out generosity of spirit towards self and towards each other and humanity is what really enables. Are you familiar with this work, or how does this integrate with your thinking, Bill? I appreciate your lecture very much. I'm just wondering if you're familiar with this, because I think it provides some answers for the Christian community.
Yeah, I'm not familiar. So the name is Siegel, Segal, or
Yes, Dr. Dan Siegel, this is his most recent book. He is with
he's a
UCLA.
It's
psychiatrist.
upside down.
Is he a psychiatrist?
A neurological scientist.
Okay, a neurologist. Okay.
Yes. And, but he has been doing studies of humanity and neurology for many years. It's just, what I find fascinating is he's provide insight on the neurological basis that integrates with the biblical narrative. And I just find it intriguing. I think it's consistent with everything you're saying.
Yeah.
It just helps us better understand how to make those right decisions. And that only comes through the centeredness of the mind, the heart, which is our connection with each other, and with the body, what we do, our actions.
Yeah. I mean, that resonates with me. I mean, what you're saying resonates with me. As a neurobiologist, we neurobiologists have a tendency to be very craniocentric. We're brain centric, but we always have to remind ourselves that the brain is connected to and integrated with and signaling back and forth to the rest of the body. And our brains do not do cognition in a vat. They do cognition in an embedded body, and that body is constantly interacting with other bodies and other people. And a huge part of human flourishing involves positive, constructive relationships with other people in the social milieus that we're in. So what you're saying resonates, and I think as Christians, that's what we would more or less expect, right? I mean, if Christianity is true, and if there were other people from other religions sitting here, I would say if certain aspects of your religions are true, then there must be neurological mechanisms that mediate these kinds of behaviors, these kinds of emotions. I don't, again, I'm coming back now to my central dogma of neurobiology, right? That all of our lives and all of our feelings and all of our wholeness and our brokenness are inextricably linked to the biology of the brain, that the biology of the brain underlies all parts of our behavior. This is axiomatic for a neurobiologist, that if you see a behavioral change, there's going to be a neurological change lying underneath it. And, I like the current emphasis in psychology to study wholeness. Psychologists spend a lot of time telling us what's wrong with us, but I think there's a lot of potential here to tell us for psychology to say what's right with us and what leads to flourishing. And I like that movement of psychology over the last decade or two. And it sounds to me like your guy Siegel is a part of that movement. And I'm very sympathetic to that.
Thank you.
Other questions? Olivia Kim, good to see you. Former student of mine.
No.
Good to see you too, Dr. Groyle. So I'll make it concise as much as I can, but first I just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Newsome, for kind of integrating the fields of philosophy and neurobiology. I'm a neuroscience graduate student, and so often people in neuroscience, when you try to get all philosophical, they say you can't think about it too much or else you're going to get lost. So thank you for opening up about this. My question, though, is about specifically your definition of autonomy and how autonomy seems to be centered around, autonomy is influenced by what I believe, what I rationalize, what I perceive, or, it's
what you value, right?
What you value, yes.
What your goals are.
I wonder how this applies also to, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but people who maybe developed completely normal and unfortunately later in life maybe contract some sort of dementia or Alzheimer's, right? And it's not usually a quick process. It's very slow and gradual. And so would you say autonomy is kind of a more relative definition? Because people, especially in early stages of Alzheimer's, they're still pretty coherent, maybe a little forgetful, but maybe towards the end, you can develop, maybe psychosis is the wrong word, but people can get paranoid. But even though we perceive them to be unable to be autonomous, in their own belief system at the time, they are autonomous. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak on that.
Yeah, this is very personal for me. My father died of Alzheimer's disease. I mean, what took him in the end was pneumonia, but by the time pneumonia took him, it was a mercy. It was a blessing. He had deteriorated to the point where he didn't even recognize his own wife. He didn't recognize anything. It's a very, very tragic situation when the mind just disappears so slowly like that. There are, examples of people with pretty severe Alzheimer's having some of their world restored to them through music, for example, and through poetry or storytelling, as long as it's stuff that goes back to their childhood. In Alzheimer's, it's the oldest memories that hang on the longest and the most recent ones that die away soonest. So, for example, long after my father would deny having his own children, and he couldn't recognize me as related to him as a child of his. I could open up a old family photo book and I'd show him pictures from his childhood, and he could say, "Yes, that's my sister," or "That's Mama." And he hadn't seen those people in decades, right? And yet he could pick them out of a picture book, and he couldn't pick his own sons out of as being related to him. So that the world does get smaller, but there's still something there of value. And there, as Olivia, since you're a graduate student in neuroscience, there are many, many people all over the world trying to crack these diseases. And I think I touched on that during the talk with that all brains are not equal, right? There are some brains that don't have as much control, and I cited psychosis as a clear example of that. But Alzheimer's is a clear example of that, but developmental disorders in some ways even more tragic, right? Because then the person that's developing never even develops what we would commonly think of as a fully mature and flourishing human being. At least in Alzheimer's, people can have long lives, right, and lose it gradually at the end. But in some ways, the developmental things are the hardest for me. And so there's this massive divergence in capabilities of nervous systems and in the way they approach God. I mean, I think Oliver Sacks, the neurologist who wrote The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and many other essays on neurological patients. I think it's Sacks, but it could be someone else who describes a person with Alzheimer's in a worship service and hearing hymns and being on their knees in an obvious posture of prayer and hearing hymns back from their childhood. And clearly, according to the person telling the story, having some kind of holy experience, even though it could not be put into words. So, there are things that go on inside of people that can't be put into words. And we have to, in the midst of the tragedy of these kinds of illnesses, we have to really keep respect for the person that once was and the person that still is in part, and the person that, we hope will be, again, one day after death. So, you're asking, really important questions, and you asked a concise question. I did not give a concise answer. I apologize for that, but those are just some reflections on the issues that you're raising. They're important issues. Where are you a graduate student, by the way?
I'm at the Stowers Institute in Kansas City.
Okay,
I don't
great.
know. Yeah.
Good. I think I've been there once. I've been to Kansas City a couple of times, but I think is yeah.
That's
Okay.
great. Thank you.
Great question, Olivia. Thanks for asking it. John Wood.
Bill, thank you so much. This is really helpful. You have a bunch of biologists here, and some of us are not skin in biologists. We're skin out biologists, right? So we're the organismal types. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking about your hierarchy, right? As you're
Yeah.
going top down, and as you were talking on that, I'm thinking relationally
Yes.
about. I mean, there's, and you invited this too. So it really started to strike me when I'm seeing things like in many organisms, an infection will cause a change, especially fungal infections cause change in behavior, dramatic changes, right? In ants climbing up, and sometimes it's related to parasitism and a parasite changes the behavior. So I'm wondering if you've thought about it, you could say something about this relationality, because I'm thinking about viruses. I'm thinking about, in particular, as you mentioned, Beck, I think it was, his approach. And I wondered if if that approach that he uses is something like this psilocybin mushroom therapy that's being used, uh,
Yeah.
which is changing behaviors, reworking old memories,
Yeah.
not in an uncontrolled way, but in a
Yeah.
very controlled fashion. Could you say more about relationality between other creatures and ourselves in that way?
Well, I think that Beck's cognitive behavioral therapy has a hugely relational component. I have never been in cognitive behavioral therapy myself, but a family member has been. And so I have a quasi inside view of it. And, a lot of it's restructuring beliefs, and Beck says patterns of interaction with the world. And that phrase, patterns of interaction, that is inherently relational. And
Yeah.
humans are hyper relational, uh, hyper social beings of all the species on the planet. We're among the most social, the most dependent on social relationships for flourishing, the most capable of magnificent good
Mhm.
when we work together socially. I mean, the structures of our cities and things just unbelievable, right? But also the most capable of doing tremendous evil when we're socially interacting, but fueled by evil desires and goals. So we are hyper relational. There is no way, I don't think, to be human and not be relational. If you're not relational, it's really bad. And I have to be careful here, but there are diseases, right? Developmental diseases where people are really impaired in their relationality, and autism and autism spectrum disorders being a primary example. And um, it is a spectrum, and the words that come out of my mouth don't apply to everyone on the spectrum. They apply to some, but when those social relationships and the ability to relate socially is damaged lightly or seriously in some ways, then um, the full and flourishing human experience is just not right now. It's not possible. We may develop ways to make it possible, and some therapies are making it more possible.
Mhm.
I think the social and relational realm is huge, and as you say, I signaled this during the talk by saying here's the 5 core levels for understanding spatial memory, but we can go levels down to atoms, or we can go levels up to uh, families, dyadic friendships, societies,
Mhm. Mhm.
internets.
Mhm.
There's a reason they call mob behavior, right? Because people act in a mob in ways that they would never act as individuals, right? So we are relationship, and we're shaped by those relationships, and we're shaped by your viruses and fungi and all kinds of things that we are not even aware of. So
Mhm.
we're influenced by fungus is in things that are bottom up, but then a mob is very much a top-down construct, right?
Right.
So you can look at those things and put that same kind of reading on them, but the relationality and the contents and discontents of relationality are just hugely important for our society.
Thank you very much. I just want to say your approach strikes me as a very fruitful way to think about a number of what we call wicked problems, these really difficult, challenging issues that do not yield themselves to either a top-down or a bottom. We have up approach. We have to take some other way, and you seem to be coming at things in another way, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
I have one. I don't know if it's a quick question or not, but it relates to David Chalmers' so-called hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah.
And if I understand it correctly, it relates to subjective experience in human consciousness and somehow defying mechanistic explanation. And somehow from there, he gets to kind of a relativistic kind of thinking about responsibility for human actions. Am I understanding his view correctly? And if so, what are your thoughts on what he said? Because it seems to differ a lot from, your, what you showed
Yeah,
about.
yeah. I actually am pretty impressed by Chalmers. I don't know the stuff that you said at the end there about the relativity. I'm not sure about where that goes, but his notions about consciousness, I'm very familiar with. Brian, do we have a hard cut here at 6 is coming up? Is that?
Not necessarily. I mean, we try to stick as close to it as we
Oh,
can, but
for people who've never heard of Chalmers, it's worth me putting up a slide with Chalmers, a direct quote from Chalmers that's in my extra slides file here. But maybe since we are running short of time, I should just try to paraphrase. And I put Chalmers talks about, he's a philosopher, and he talks about the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness. And the easy problems of consciousness are understanding things like attention and memory and perception and decision making, these cognitive functions, trying to understand them mechanistically the way so many neuroscientists are. He calls them easy, kind of tongue in cheek, because this is biology. It's very, very challenging biology. There's nothing easy about it at all, but it is possible in principle to envision a mechanistic solution to these problems. And he said, then there's a hard problem of consciousness. And the hard problem of consciousness is that why should there be feelings at all? He's in the quote that I would show you, he says, it's relatively easy to imagine manufacturing robots that perceive the world in a sense. They have cameras, they have auditory detectors, they have sensors on their robotic hands, they have sensory input. They can make decisions, probably trained by some AI thing, and they can navigate in the world. They can avoid obstacles. They can get up after they fall. The most impressive robots that I've seen can fall and right themselves. And so Chalmers says that a lot of these things, decision making, perception, motor responses, orchestrated motor responses, they're challenging. That's the easy problem, but they're not fundamentally mysterious. And he says that consciousness is fundamentally mysterious. Why and how the interactions of all of these small components create the conscious state that we are conscious of ourselves and can reflect on our own behavior and our own consciousness. He says that's fundamentally mysterious. And there's a famous essay by a philosopher named Thomas Nagel, What is it like to be a bat? And I would recommend that essay to anyone who's interested in these issues. It's fun read. If you just Google what is it like to be a bat, it will come up. And Nagel invites us to imagine what it feels like to be a bat and navigating the world through sonar, remitting these waves, getting them back, and what it feels like inside the nervous system. And of course, the truth is we can know as many facts about that as we want to know, but we can't know what it actually feels like to be inside a bat's head and body and experience the world. I can hardly even know what it's like to be inside my wife's head and body and experience the world, or my cat, much less a bat. Yeah. And for Chalmers and for Nagel, what the point they're making is that there is something about consciousness, that's sort of what is it like to be that there are real questions about whether our third-person science can ever treat them and understand them adequately. Because, and Nagel makes this point very clear, makes this argument very clear, our science that we do in this day and age is third person. It's objective. It's by design, it's objective. If I make discoveries in my lab, I can ship them off to various places in the world to anyone who has the conceptual background and who has the technical tools to carry it out. If what I think I've discovered is true, they can verify it. It's objective. It's reproducible, right? But the feelings inside of a person, inside of an individual bat or an individual human being, they are not objective. They are subjective. And there's a real question about whether objective science can ever understand the subjective experience. So, maybe we could one day get to a neuroscience where we can trace the signals from a visual stimulus coming into the eye, know what all the retinal ganglion cells are doing, understand how all that information is transmitted to the cortex, understand the decision-making mechanisms and then the motor output mechanisms, and understand that thing from, the beginning to the end mechanistically, but still not understand what it feels like to have that experience. And Nagel says that the more you objectify these things, it doesn't take you closer to the subjective experience. It takes you farther away by definition. And so there may be this category problem here where we're applying objective techniques to try to understand subjective phenomena. And that's what Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness.
Okay.
Because in yeah, and this is what Dean Zimmerman was referring to when he talked about this. That was the point of all of his Marion, the colorblind color scientist, when he went off on that riff and color during his talk. This is exactly the point that he's trying to make. How do I know that my experience of the red is the same as your experience of red? And I think Chalmers and Nagel are on something important here. And Zimmerman basically used that as a way to define or say that property dualism is a real thing that Christians and people who do serious behavioral science should take seriously, because there is this property of being internal subjective experience that simply may not be amenable and may be of a different character to our third person descriptions of it. And describing it in the third person is not communicating the essence of what it is like to be a subject. And I take that pretty seriously. Many neuroscientists would deny that there's a hard problem. Neuroscientists knee-jerk. They want to know, they're imperial. We're conquering the world here. And once we neuroscientists get through with things, we're going to understand all this stuff, and make it all perfectly clear. And I think that may be too arrogant of a statement. So I'm with Chalmers, but I don't know about that relativistic thing that you mentioned there at the end.
Okay. Well, I may have misunderstood. Okay, we'll take one more question. Stephen Reinbold, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Related to something earlier, similarities among religions. C.S. Lewis referred to that as the Tao. He wrote a book about it, and he said those similarities, well, basically, I'll cut to the chase. He said they had to come from God, and that would even kind of bypass, I think you're talking about all your aspirations. So like, it sounds like they would be coming through society. That would be their source to the human. I think C.S. Lewis thought somehow it was inherent because of the similarities. Now, I don't know if that's Oh, and one last thing. That was an important part of my becoming a Christian, so no pressure.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a Christian anthropology, seeing this universe as being a holy universe, and a purposeful universe and a meaningful universe and not a pointless thing. The notion that God interacts with people and maybe with other species for all we know and other creatures on other planets, that is not a strange notion. That follows kind of directly. And the fact that our psyche and our brains seem to have a receptive posture toward God and toward holiness, however much we distort it and get off on the wrong paths, and God knows religion has gotten off on destructive and wrong paths way too many times during the centuries and even right now in our own time. But somehow the conviction is that there's a truth there and that there is a relationship between creator and created, and that was part of the design from the beginning. However, that design plays out and whatever mechanisms are used to create it, including evolutionary mechanisms, which I would conclude there. So as with so many things, C.S. Lewis has, I think, the right intuitions and the right leaning there that, whatever human medium those insights and that deep sense of holiness and relatedness come through, that's of God. I mean, if I'm understanding what you said correctly.
Yeah, I think you basically hit it. Yeah, it was just that he thought that, therefore, I don't know that he would say the origin was not in the brain, but somehow it was implanted in there, I think, by God, and that would be basically it. I think you're agreeing. If not, that's fine.
I am.
Okay, great.
I am agreeing.
That's better.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's time to bring this session to a close. Bill, thanks again for being our keynote speaker this evening. And thank you all for joining us for this presentation of the affiliation of Christian biologists, the affiliation of ministers, theologians, and philosophers, and the American Scientific Affiliation. Stay tuned for future announcements about what will likely be the final event in this collaborative series on the human soul, human identity, and human consciousness. If you're interested in getting more information about the ACB, AMTAP, or the parent organization, the American Scientific Affiliation, send us an email at asa@asa3.org. Again, the email address is asa@asa3.org. As we close out this evening in prayer, I'd like to ask Walter Rohiro if he would lead us in prayer. Walter?
Certainly. Let's pray together. God our Father, you made us in your image to be salt and light and the body of your dear Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, in this world. And you love us beyond measure or understanding. Let us so use our lives that we be found faithful servants for your kingdom, doorkeepers on this earth of the gate through which all joy and wholeness come. Name and image bearers of your Son, by whom all is made well and restored to you, and vessels of your Spirit, rightly steering the ship of our being to the haven of your rest. Fill us with delight in knowing and serving you, and make us beacons to a world adrift. Fill us with compassion for others, and make us healers and helpers to a world polarized. Fill us with peace and your presence in the midst of the chaos and challenges of life, and make us makers and keepers of peace in a world of growing anger, polarization, and hatred. Bless and watch over us and those we care about, that we might bless and rightly care for others. Make us virtuous, filled with knowledge, courage, faith, hope, and love. And go with us as we go from this time, that we might serve you wholeheartedly in spirit and truth. We ask this in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, who was and is and evermore shall be. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Walter. And if I didn't say it before his prayer, Walter is the president of the Ministers, Theologians, and Philosophers group that is co-hosting the event with us this evening. Be sure to check out the ACB group pages on Facebook and LinkedIn. I just wish you all a good night and thank you all for attending.